The Lord said to Samuel, "How long are you going to grieve over Saul? I have rejected him as king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and get going. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem because I have found my next king among his sons." "How can I do that?" Samuel asked. "When Saul hears of it, he'll kill me." "Take a heifer with you," the Lord replied, "and say, 'I have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will make clear to you what you should do. You will anoint for me the person I point out to you." Samuel did what the Lord instructed. When he came to Bethlehem, the city elders came to meet him. They were shaking with fear. "Do you come in peace?" they asked. "Yes," Samuel answered. "I've come to make a sacrifice to the Lord." "Now make yourself holy, then come with me to the sacrifice." Samuel made Jesse and his sons holy and invited them to the sacrifice as well. When they arrived, Samuel looked at Eliab and thought, "That must the Lord's anointed right in front." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Have no regard for his appearance or stature, because I haven't selected him." God doesn't look at things like humans do. Humans see only what is visible to the eyes, but the Lord sees into the heart. Next, Jesse called for Abinadab, who presented him to Samuel, but he said, "The Lord hasn't chosen this one either." So Jesse presented Shammah, but Samuel did know the Lord hasn't chosen this one. Jesse presented 7 of his sons to Samuel, but Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord hasn't picked any of these." Then Samuel asked Jesse, "Is that all of your boys?" "There is still the youngest one," Jesse answered, "but he's out keeping the sheep." "Send for him," Samuel said Jesse, "because we cannot proceed until he gets here." So Jesse sent and brought him in. He was reddish brown, had beautiful eyes, and was good looking. The Lord said, "That's the one. Go anoint him." So Samuel took the horns of oil and anointed him right there in front of his brothers. The Lord's spirits came over David from that point forward. Then Samuel left and went to Ramah.
All right. Thank you. You did a whole lot better pronouncing those names than I ever do. Thank you, Megan. And that's true. I'm horrible at those names. So there is a feature on Facebook you may be familiar with if you're on Facebook that's called Memories. Facebook Memories. Each day I get a notification that takes me to a page on Facebook that shows me everything I have posted on that particular date, going all the way back to when I first joined Facebook in like 2007 or whenever. And sometimes it's a fun trip down memory lane, right? It's a great nostalgic trip. Just yesterday, in my Facebook memories was 6 years ago. On that date, I presided at a wedding of Kelly and Jorge Arujo. Kelly is Kenneth's sister. They're here for the baptism and here for their 6th anniversary celebration, obviously. I mean, I can't imagine who else you would want to spend it with than your favorite old pastor. But then there's some memories that I come across that I'm like, ooh, delete. I'm sure they're stored somewhere in a database until the end of time, but I'm not running for public office, so I should be fine, right? It's never going to come back to haunt me. But then there are other memories that are painful for other reasons, ones that deleting won't do as much good on. It was 2 years ago this past week that we shut everything down because of this emerging pandemic that we, at that point, knew nothing about. We were in unknown territory. We were entering into a time in the wilderness. We didn't realize we were entering into a time of the wilderness. Again, we really had no clue based on what we know now, what we knew then, going back to those memories. I'm like, wow, I hope I never have to go back and do that again. I hope when they say these are 100-year plagues, that they are in fact 100-year plagues. No one knew how long it was going to last. And it wasn't much fun to revisit those memories once again as we were trying to figure out how to do church when we weren't gathering in person, how to do life, how to do our work when offices are shut down and when we're not sure if it's safe to go to the, just on and on, all of these memories flooding back, and it's been a roller coaster ride as things have ebbed and flowed. I was thinking of that as I was reading through 1 Samuel, as we're going through our Bible here in the story of Scripture that the Israelites understood what it was like to be on a roller coaster ride. They had their own kind of plagues, but for other reasons. They had their own roller coaster rides. The Israelites were rescued from slavery in Egypt, and not 3 days into the wilderness, they wanted to go back. I remember posting some things about that, like can we get back to normal already? How long is this going to last? 3 days in the wilderness, they want to go back to Egypt. Sure, we're free from slavery now, but what we really want is security. What we really want is comfort of our old routine. We don't want everything to be upended. And then they made covenant with God at Mount Sinai, and before Moses can even come down from the mountain, they want the familiarity of an old idol they can worship. They have the golden calf. A calf was a familiar symbol of gods in that era. It gave them comfort. It gave them something they could cling to and hold on to. And Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey all the covenant commandments, but as we read, they failed over and over again because their future was uncertain and they weren't sure what was coming next. And when they did get a glimpse of what awaited them in the promised land, they had a failure of nerve and a failure of heart. But the wilderness is just hard. We don't want to go forward. We don't think we can stay here, so let's go back to Egypt again. They turned on their leader Moses. They turned on one another. It was a miracle they made it to the promised land at all, even after 40 years. And of course, it doesn't get a lot better in the promised land. That's what the book of Judges is all about. And in Judges, it's one story after another of an invading army that terrorizes them, that takes away their livelihood, that takes away their sense of well-being. And God brings these judges, these tribal leaders up who sets things right and lets them get back to normal for a time. And they think they have it all contained, but then there's another surge of an army, another spike. And this roller coaster continues. Life was just uncertain, and it was unstable for them. Life was full of anxiety and of fear, of frustration, and of anger. All things that we can relate to. And ultimately, that's why they believed they needed a king. That's what the book of 1 Samuel is really about. It's telling the story of Israel transitioning from this confederation of tribes to a unified kingdom under the kingdom under ruled by King David. And that's what 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel show us. Last week, we looked at the story of Samuel. We looked at his call, and Samuel was called to be a judge and a priest and a prophet for Israel, but we find out his children were corrupt. And so while the people trusted in Samuel, their future became unstable again. We don't know what to expect. Who's going to lead us now that Samuel is getting old? And so they said, give us a king. Give us a king like all of the other nations. And Samuel, it seems, was personally insulted by that. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 7 and 8, God has to tell him, you know what, Samuel, comply with the people's request. They haven't rejected you. Don't take it personally, Samuel. God said, no, they've rejected me. They've rejected me as king over them. They are doing to you only what they've been doing to me from the day I brought them out of Egypt, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. McGray Vega, who's a pastor at Hyde Park United Methodist, who wrote our Bible year materials, he says that given that all that Israel has been through, all of the ups and downs, the reason they want a king is because the king represents for them comfort and stability and security, and that's what they want more than anything else. That's what a king represented for them. When the Israelites said, we want a king, what they're really saying is we want this roller coaster to stop. Can all of this just go away so that we can live our lives? And for a while, they thought God had given them exactly what they needed. Their first king, Saul, he looked the part. We're told that he was tall, that he was handsome, he was a force of nature, he was full of charisma. He conquered all of their enemies, and he brought them all of these victories. But it didn't take long for them to realize something about Saul, and that is looks can be deceiving. Because Saul is actually a very tragic figure. He begins so full of promise, but his character flaws catch up with him. He's dishonest. He lacks integrity. He seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes, and there are plenty of mistakes that he makes. And ultimately, like the Israelites before, he just fails to obey God. And that's all that God has asked of him. And so Israel learns the hard way that the things that we most naturally turn to give ourselves a sense of security and comfort, a sense of control and normalcy, are things that don't last. And so God does in these kinds of situations what God does. He gave the Israelites a second chance to learn an important lesson. And it's the same lesson that we need to learn today. They needed a reminder of what's most important in times of uncertainty. And that key lesson came to them in the most unsuspecting person. We heard in our scripture lesson today. God directs Samuel to Bethlehem, to the family of Jesse. One of Jesse's sons was going to be the new king. And the first one that Samuel saw, Eliab, see, I can't say any of these words. We'll call him Eliabs, because he looked the part. He was ripped. Samuel was sure this guy is the one. This looks like a king. And that's when God said to Samuel, have no regard for the appearance or stature, because I haven't selected him. God doesn't look at things like humans do. Humans see only what's visible to the eyes, but the Lord sees into the heart. And so Samuel went through all of Jesse's sons, and none of them were selected by God. And it tells you how little David was regarded, because Jesse was told, bring all of your sons to present to Samuel, and he doesn't bring David. Leaves David out in the fields. He didn't even use David's name. He said, well, there's just still the youngest one. The Hebrew word there means still the runt. He's out keeping the sheep. So little regarded, his own father didn't even say his name or think to invite him to this particular party. And in fact, he was just a kid. He wasn't tall. He wasn't handsome like Saul or even like his older brothers. He didn't look the part of a king. He was the last person you would ever imagine to bring the Israelites a sense of strength and security and comfort and normalcy, to lead them as a shepherd leads his flock of sheep. But we are reminded that we do not see the way God sees. And I think that's why pride is listed among the deadly sins. Because sometimes we can just be so sure of ourselves. We take our stand with such certainty, without question or without doubt, assuming that we know all and see all and have it all figured out. And yet we see in this scripture and countless others that we just don't see the way God sees. That God humbles the proud and God lifts up the lowly. God doesn't look at things like humans do. Humans see what's visible to the eyes, but the Lord sees the heart. God sees the heart. Our Lenten series is holy character, those virtues that God is trying to build in us. And we've looked at loyalty and attentiveness to God in the last stories of Scripture. And this is about the heart. This part of holy character is about character. Our character. That's what God cares about. That's what moves us through times of uncertainty and times of upheaval and times when we feel like nothing is certain or sure. It's our character that remains. No matter the circumstances, no matter what kind of craziness is happening in the world around us, no matter what kind of wilderness we feel we're wandering in, no matter what sense of normalcy we feel like we have lost, or how out of control we feel, or what freedoms we think others are taking from us, no matter what's happening in our external surroundings, it doesn't matter. Because what matters is what's happening in our hearts. That's where God looks. And our question is, do we trust God with our whole heart? Do we trust God with a part of us that no one else can see? I think that's the message God asked for Samuel. That's why God chose David. His resume was not at the top of the stack for king. And David was by no means perfect, as we'll read in 2 Samuel. But the message remains. God looks at the heart. When we're living in the midst of fear and uncertainty, and certainly we do in countless ways even now, we still face toxic and sinful divisions in our communities, even in our churches, certainly in our world. We're looking at a war instigated by a country with nuclear weapons. We try not to think about it too much, but for those who've lived through the Cold War, you know that there's some echoes here. There's so many things like that that are just out of our control. It's just the world that we live in. And we can live in denial of it, or we can acknowledge that as much as we think we've got it all together, it can disappear just like that. It takes one illness, one bad blood report, one bad screening, one wrong turn, one decision by somebody who we don't even know who ends up tearing our world apart. We can't control those things, but we can control our character. We can control our commitment to God and who we are in the midst of both sunshine and storms. We can control how we love God and how we love other people. John Wesley wrote a sermon, the founder of Methodism, 1741, just as the Methodist movement was getting started and it was starting to spread, and people were like, who in the world are these Methodists who are kind of infiltrating all of our churches here in England, getting on our nerves? So Wesley wrote a sermon. He later published it as a tract called The Character of a Methodist. And he said, there's just one thing that distinguishes a Methodist. And he said, it's not any single point of doctrine. It's not a particular interpretation of Scripture versus another way of interpreting Scripture. It's not a style of worship or anything else that's outwardly obvious. He said what characterizes a Methodist is that the love of God is shed abroad in your heart. That was a criteria. It was a heart thing. Don't pay attention to outward appearances. God's only looking at your character, your commitment, your ability to love others. God is looking at what's in your heart, and that can bring comfort or it can terrify us. Because a lot of us have spent a lot of time making sure that we look good in front of the world, and God just brushes that aside and says, no, what's in your heart? But for those who struggle, for those who feel pushed down by the world and stepped on or ignored or not ever seen, God knowing our heart is good news, because we know any of that stuff doesn't matter anyway. Don't pay attention to outward appearances. That's what we need to be about. That's what our church needs to be about. Do we have the love of God shed abroad in our hearts? Do we love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength? Do we love our neighbors as ourselves? And other folks are going to look at this church, or they're going to look at any church, and they're going to look at outward appearances. They're going to look at the size of our buildings and how well they're maintained. They're going to look at how many people have gathered here and worship on any given Sunday. They'll look at our calendar events. What programs do we have for children and for youth? And what Sunday school classes do we have? And what Bible studies? And how good looking is the preacher? Or maybe whether he should look into CrossFit. They look at our website. They look at our live stream. They look at our social media presence. And we might judge our own church by those very same things. But so in our life, so in our church, God doesn't look at outward appearances, but looks at the heart, your heart and my heart. It's really about our commitment to love God and to love all. That's what it means to be the church. It's what it's always meant. It's what it always will mean. It's what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ, and that will never change. And so how is your heart today? How are you deepening in your love of God? And how are you widening your reach to love God and love others, to make sure every single person knows of the embrace of God's grace?